Imagine a country that was carved up, humiliated, and left for dead by the world's greatest powers. A country where tens of millions of people starved. Not because of drought, not because of floods, but because of one man's catastrophic decision. A country that was so broken, so shattered, that in 1900, absolutely nobody would have bet a single dollar on its survival. And yet, today, that same country holds over $1 trillion of American debt. Its military patrols the Pacific Ocean. Its technology sits inside your pocket right now. And its leader is actively planning to become the most powerful nation on Earth by 2049. That country is China. And here's the twist nobody talks about. The single most shocking secret buried inside this entire story. I'm saving it for the very end. Trust me, you'll want to stay for it, because once you hear it, you'll never look at the world the same way again. Let's go. The year is 1900, while America is building skyscrapers and Europe is racing through the Industrial Revolution. China is frozen in time. The Qing Dynasty, a royal bloodline that had ruled for over 250 years, is crumbling from the inside. The Empress Dowager Cixi, an aging and deeply stubborn ruler, sits on the dragon throne, refusing to modernize. Foreign powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and more, have already sliced off pieces of China like it's a birthday cake at a party they weren't invited to. And the Chinese people, they've had enough. A secret society known in the West as the Boxers rises up. These young men genuinely believe that martial arts training made them bulletproof. Literally bulletproof. They storm foreign embassies in Beijing, attack Christian missionaries, and set off a chain reaction that shakes the entire country. The response from the outside world is swift and brutal. 8 foreign nations send a combined military force into China. They march into Beijing. They loot the Forbidden City. The Empress Dowager flees in disguise, dressed as a peasant woman. When the dust settles, China is forced to sign what historians call one of the most humiliating documents in modern history. The Boxer Protocol. Massive financial penalties, foreign troops permanently stationed on Chinese soil, and a national pride so deeply wounded that the scars would fuel revolution for decades. This was a dying empire taking its last breath. In 1911, the impossible happened. The Qing Dynasty collapsed. Not with a bang, but almost quietly, like a building whose foundation had been rotting for years. A visionary doctor named Sun Yat-sen declared the Republic of China. His dream, a modern, democratic nation that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Western world. Beautiful idea, terrible timing, because China in 1911 wasn't a unified country. It was a patchwork of territories controlled by warlords, ruthless military strongmen who collected taxes, raised private armies, and answered to nobody. Sun Yat-sen had a dream, but he had no real power to enforce it. He died in 1925, his dream unfinished, his country still bleeding. Into that vacuum stepped 2 men who could not have been more different, and whose rivalry would define China for the next century. On one side, Chiang Kai-shek, nationalist, westernized, backed by the wealthy merchant class and supported by the United States. On the other side, Mao Zedong, communist, radical, the son of a peasant farmer who spoke for the hundreds of millions of poor, hungry, forgotten Chinese who worked the land and had nothing to show for it. Their collision was inevitable, and when it came, it was catastrophic. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek made a decision that would haunt China's history forever. He ordered the massacre of thousands of Communist Party members in Shanghai. It happened overnight, without warning. Men pulled from their beds, shot in the streets. Mao barely escaped with his life. Most people would have quit. Mao did the opposite. He gathered what remained of his forces, desperate, half-starved soldiers, and embarked on one of the most extraordinary military retreats in human history. They called it the Long March, nearly 6,000 miles on foot, through frozen mountain passes, raging rivers, and barren deserts. Over 100,000 soldiers began that journey. Fewer than 10,000 survived, but those who did, they became legends, and Mao emerged from the Long March not as a defeated man, but as an almost mythological figure. Then Japan attacked. In 1937, the Japanese military launched a full-scale invasion of China. What followed in the city of Nanjing was a war crime of staggering proportions. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of civilians were murdered in a matter of weeks. The Nanjing Massacre, a wound in Chinese memory that has never fully healed. Chiang and Mao were forced into an uneasy alliance against Japan. But the moment World War II ended and Japan surrendered, the gloves came off again. The Civil War resumed, and this time it ended decisively. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in Beijing before a roaring crowd of hundreds of thousands and declared in that thunderous voice of his, "The Chinese people have stood up. The People's Republic of China was born." A new flag, a new anthem, and for hundreds of millions of peasants who had known nothing but poverty and war, genuine, overwhelming hope. But revolutions are far better at tearing things down than building them up. Mao was a military genius and a political mastermind. But running a modern economy, that was a completely different game, and the consequences of getting it wrong were unthinkable. In 1958, Mao launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. The plan was audacious: transform China from a rural agricultural society into a modern industrial powerhouse in just a few years. Farmers were ordered to stop growing food and start producing steel. Backyard furnaces were built across the entire country. The steel they produced was mostly useless, and back in the fields, the crops rotted. What followed was the deadliest famine in recorded human history. Between 1959 and 1961, an estimated 30 to 45 million people died of starvation, not from a natural disaster, not from an enemy invasion, from a policy decision. The Chinese government suppressed this truth for decades. Even today, it is not openly discussed inside China. That is the first major twist in this story, and it's one that the world still hasn't fully processed. Then came the Cultural Revolution. 1966 to 1976. Mao, paranoid about losing his grip on power, unleashed China's youth against its own culture. Teachers were publicly humiliated. Intellectuals were sent to labor camps for re-education. Ancient temples were demolished. Books were burned. An entire generation lost their education, their careers, their futures to serve one man's ego. When Mao finally died in 1976, China was exhausted, traumatized, and deeply broken. Here's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The man who saved China from itself had been fired 3 times by Mao Zedong. His name was Deng Xiaoping, and he was about to pull off one of the most remarkable economic transformations in the history of civilization. Deng wasn't interested in ideology, he was interested in results. He said something that perfectly captured his philosophy. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. Translation: forget the communist rulebook. Let's find out what actually works. He opened up special economic zones along China's coast, areas where foreign companies could invest, build factories, and operate under market rules. The fishing village of Shenzhen was one of them. Within a decade, it became one of the most industrialized cities on the planet. Foreign money poured in. Chinese factories roared to life. Hundreds of millions of people began the slow climb out of poverty. But then, 1989, hundreds of thousands of students flooded into Tiananmen Square in Beijing. They weren't there for a concert, they were demanding democracy, freedom of the press, an end to government corruption. The government sent in tanks. The exact death toll is still unknown and still classified. One man holding 2 shopping bags, standing alone in front of a column of tanks. That image became one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. China chose economic growth over political freedom, and it has never looked back. Through the 1990s and 2000s, China made itself absolutely indispensable to the global economy. Look around the room you're sitting in right now. The shoes on your feet, the clothes on your back, your television, your laptop, your kids' toys. There's a very good chance the label says "Made in China." In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, a decision championed partly by the United States, which believed that economic integration would eventually nudge China toward democracy. That bet did not pay off. What it did do was supercharge the Chinese economy beyond anyone's projections. China's GDP grew at nearly 10% per year for 3 decades straight. To put that in perspective, no major economy in human history had ever sustained that kind of growth for that long. Then came 2008, the Beijing Olympics. China stood on the world stage in the most spectacular opening ceremony anyone had ever seen. 2008 drummers performing in perfect synchronized precision, a display of human coordination that looked almost supernatural. That same year, the global financial crisis hit. Wall Street collapsed. European banks teetered. The American economy went into freefall. China kept growing. In 2012, a new leader took power in Beijing. His name was Xi Jinping, and from day one, it was clear. This man had a very different vision than his predecessors. Where previous leaders had kept a low profile internationally, Deng's famous advice was to hide your strength, bide your time. Xi had no interest in hiding anything. He launched the Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure project since the Roman Empire. Roads, railways, ports, and pipelines across 60-plus countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Critics called it a debt trap. China loans countries money to build infrastructure, and when they can't repay, China gains strategic control. Supporters called it the engine of global development. At home, Xi consolidated power in ways that shocked even veteran China watchers. He abolished presidential term limits, meaning he could theoretically rule for life. He built a surveillance state of breathtaking scale, facial recognition cameras on every corner, social credit scores tracking citizen behavior, and an AI-powered system of control that George Orwell couldn't have imagined. Internationally, China began flexing. It built artificial islands in the South China Sea and installed military bases on them. It crushed Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. It launched what the United Nations and multiple governments have described as a systematic campaign of oppression against the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang. The West issued statements. China ignored them, and through all of this, the economy kept growing. Late 2019, a city called Wuhan, a virus nobody had seen before, COVID-19 exploded out of China and consumed the entire planet. Over 6 million people died worldwide. The global economy contracted in ways not seen since the Great Depression. And the central question, where did this virus actually come from, remains one of the most explosive, politically charged, and genuinely unresolved mysteries in modern science. Did it emerge naturally from an animal market? Did it leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology? China blocked independent investigations. Key data was never shared. We still don't know. And that uncertainty has fundamentally poisoned the relationship between China and the West. While the world was locked down, Chinese factories stayed open. China's exports actually increased during the pandemic. The country that started the crisis emerged from it in a stronger economic position than when it began. Then the competition shifted into overdrive. The United States began restricting China's access to advanced semiconductors, the microchips that power everything from smartphones to artificial intelligence to military weapons. The goal was simple: slow China down, keep it technologically dependent. China's response was equally simple: build our own. By 2025, a Chinese AI company called DeepSeek stunned Silicon Valley when it released an artificial intelligence model that rivaled the best American systems. Built at a fraction of the cost, using chips that weren't even the most advanced available. The message was loud and clear: you can't contain us. Today, China is at the most consequential crossroads in its modern history. On one side of the ledger, the achievements are genuinely staggering. China lifted approximately 800 million people out of extreme poverty in less than 40 years. That is the single largest poverty reduction in human history. It has its own space station, the world's largest navy by number of ships, a high-speed rail network that covers more distance than the rest of the world combined, and an economy that by some measurements has already surpassed the United States. On the other side, the warning signs are serious. China's population is shrinking. The one-child policy enforced for decades created a demographic time bomb that is now going off. There are not enough young workers to support an aging population. The real estate sectors, which represents roughly 30% of the Chinese economy, is in free fall. Youth unemployment hit record highs, and the government eventually just stopped publishing the data. Taiwan remains the single most dangerous flashpoint on the planet. China considers it a rogue province that must eventually be reunified by force if necessary. The United States has pledged to defend it. Both sides are building up their military presence in the Pacific. One miscalculation, one incident, could set off a conflict with consequences the world hasn't seen since 1945. Alright, here it is. The moment I promised you at the beginning. For the last 40 years, the United States has been China's single greatest enabler. American corporations moved their factories to China, chasing cheap labor, flooding Chinese workers with jobs, and building up China's industrial base with American capital. American consumers bought trillions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, essentially funding the very economic miracle that made China powerful. America pushed to get China into the WTO. American universities educated hundreds of thousands of Chinese engineers and scientists, many of whom went home and built the companies now competing with American tech giants. The United States, with the best of intentions, helped create its own most formidable rival. And here's the deeper twist. The reason this matters beyond just US-China relations. China has proven something that the Western world did not want to be true. You do not need democracy to develop economically. You do not need free speech to build advanced technology. You do not need an open society to lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. China's model, authoritarian government plus market economics, is now being studied and copied by governments across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. If that model keeps succeeding and China keeps rising, then the entire post-World War II argument that freedom and prosperity go hand in hand will face its greatest test in history. That is what's really at stake, not just China's future, but the future of how the world chooses to be governed. And that right there is the story of China. From a shattered empire on its knees in 1900 to the most consequential geopolitical force on Earth in 2026. A country that survived foreign invasion, civil war, self-inflicted famine, and a cultural revolution that nearly erased its own history. A country that made choices, some brilliant, some monstrous, and somehow emerged from all of it as a civilization that absolutely refuses to be counted out. Whether you admire China, fear it, or simply try to understand it, one thing is certain: what happens in that country over the next 25 years will shape the world that your children grow up in. Now, I've got a question for you. Which country's history do you want us to cover next? Drop it in the comments right now. Russia, Japan, India, Germany, Iran, the Ottoman Empire. Your vote decides the next video. And if you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know this channel delivers. So hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. History isn't just the past, it's the blueprint for everything coming next. See you in the next one.